Welcome back to an all-new episode of the Patronus Pages. Today we will be doing a reading from the popular fan-fiction, The Many Deaths of Harry Potter. Let's dive right in. Chapter 20, Hagrid. Healing spells? I haven't even started to look at healing magic, Hermione said. She was staring at the book in front of her. Harry sat frozen. Part of him still felt a void where his stomach had been, and he felt suddenly nauseous. He was on the train, and his presents from Neville and Hermione lay opened in front of him. It'd probably be a good idea, Harry forced himself to say again, given the number of trolls and giant dogs running through the halls. Hermione nodded, already looking through the book. Neville looked with her. His wand had already been gotten for him early when Hermione had taken him to Ollivander's. "I think I need to head for the loo," Harry said. Without looking back, Harry quickly made his way out of their car and he headed for the loo. He didn't bother to hide himself. In the mood he was in, anyone who got in his way would regret it. He stared at his face in the mirror once he reached the loo. He felt nauseous, but this time he didn't retch. Maybe this time he was getting used to being murdered. A little. In the next 5 months, he had to change everything. If he didn't, he'd be trapped in his first year, repeating it again and again. That was the definition of hell. He'd always moved on by surviving, and this time he intended to do more than survive. Quirrell's flesh had burned when he'd touched it. That was a major discovery, and possibly something that could alter the balance of power. Harry had no idea why it was happening. Possibly it had something to do with the prophecy. He'd hurt when he touched Quirrell, but he hadn't taken any damage. Maybe he and Voldemort literally couldn't exist in the same universe without killing each other. It didn't matter why, but like his invisibility cloak, it was a tool that was almost useless if Quirrell and Voldemort knew about it. He had to keep the gameskeeper at his job so that the Death Eaters didn't have a chance to get their own man in the position. For the first time, Harry cursed his own lack of curiosity. While the other students had gossiped about what had happened to Hagrid, Harry hadn't been interested. There had been something about his harbouring an illicit dragon. He wasn't even exactly clear on when it had happened, although it was sometime in May. Harry had been distracted, worrying about Voldemort's plots, and he hadn't really been concerned about any of the other teachers. It was clear to him now that there was more than one way to attack someone. By removing one employee, Voldemort had created an opportunity for himself, one he'd been quick to take advantage of. Harry had to endure 5 more months of classes with Quirrell. The boredom of having to repeat the classes was bad enough, without having to listen to his incessant taunting. At least now he knew Dumbledore wasn't a complete fool. He'd listened to Harry's complaint, and he'd waited until he could get proof to act. That meant that Harry didn't actually have to murder Quirrell as much as he sometimes wanted to. All he had to do was reveal him where Dumbledore or the other teachers could see, and he would be expelled from the school. Of course, even if Quirrell was placed in Azkaban, Harry wouldn't be safe. Quirrell dead was much safer than Quirrell imprisoned. After what he'd seen Quirrell do to the unicorns, Harry wasn't sure he shouldn't kill him. The man was dying, probably because he had an evil face tumor in his head. Getting actual evidence on him would require following him, something that made Harry want to sick up into the wash basin. He'd faced Quirrell 3 times in battle, and 3 times he'd lost. He'd have to get better at stealth, much better. The risk of following the man who was actively trying to kill him, who literally had eyes in the back of his head, was enormous. Harry had let Quirrell and his passenger dictate his life for too long. He'd let him reduce his life to nothing, and it was time to take his life back. "I thought you lived with muggles," Flitwick said. Harry was covered in sweat and sitting on a bench. Learning to dodge behind objects was difficult, and he needed to get in better shape, although the possibility that whatever gains he might make could be erased in an instant were frustrating. "I do," Harry said. Flitwick frowned. "You've gotten better, much, much better. If someone is training you, I'd like to meet them and learn how they taught you 6 months of training in 2 weeks. Harry froze. He could hardly say that Flitwick had been the one to train him, and any other answer would sound like a lie. His mind raced, and finally he said, "People's families would be in danger if I revealed everyone who trained me." Although Weasley knew or would know that Pusey had been Harry's friend, Harry hadn't told anyone about the training. Putting Pusey's family in danger wouldn't be fair, or just after everything he had done. Flitwick said, "When this is all over, I hope you ask them to talk to me. Whatever their teaching methods are, they are hugely effective." Harry looked at him for a moment, then said bleakly, "I doubt anyone would like them. Learning like this is difficult. I wouldn't recommend it for anyone who didn't have to do it." Flitwick stared at him sympathetically, but said, "If you continue to progress like this, you'll be a wizard to contend with someday." The sooner the better, as far as Harry was concerned. The last thing he wanted was to be a 30-year-old wizard stuck in the body of a 13-year-old, repeating the same year endlessly. It was his idea of hell. His performance in the fight with Quirrell, his third loss to the same man, proved that once a week of training with Flitwick wasn't nearly enough. The problem was that none of the other Slytherins were nearly as sympathetic as Pusey had been. Harry suspected that he'd helped him as much out of pity as anything else. Harry had chosen Pusey carefully, mostly because of his reputation for fairness and honesty and his lack of pure-blooded ideologies. None of the others fit as well as he had. Those who were brave also had suspect associations. Those who lacked those associations weren't particularly brave. Harry doubted that he'd be able to get anyone to help him that wouldn't betray him. Turning to the other professors was out as well. McGonagall and Dumbledore were both far too busy with their duties. Madam Hooch didn't particularly like him. Sprout didn't seem like she'd be a very effective duelist. Professor Sinestra might be good, but he didn't know enough about her, and she didn't seem particularly open. He didn't know the other professors very well, including Hagrid, whose presence back at the head table was a little jarring. Harry wasn't sure exactly how old the dragon was when it had set everything on fire, and he wasn't sure how long Hagrid had possessed the egg before it had hatched. The simplest thing to do was to read up on dragons. He wasn't even sure what kind of dragon it had been, but he still remembered what it had looked like. Hermione might be willing to help. She was ridiculously easy to talk into anything that resembled research, and if he figured out a time frame that Hagrid might come into possession of the egg, he'd be able to figure out something to do about it. First, though, he needed to cultivate a relationship with the man. Showing up on his doorstep the day he got a dragon egg demanding that he give it up wasn't likely to be persuasive. Sometimes talking was more effective than force. Harry hoped that this was one of those times, because he doubted anyone could physically force Hagrid to do anything he didn't want to do. He'd asked Neville and Hermione to ask around about Hagrid. His reputation was bad enough that he couldn't ask questions without it being noticed. The Slytherins would report whatever he asked to their parents, and he might end up getting Hagrid sacked even faster than he had been the last time. Slipping his invisibility cloak off after looking carefully around, Harry knocked on the door to Hagrid's hut. The sounds of loud barking came from within, and Harry wondered suddenly if the man had moved the three-headed dog into his hut. From what Hermione had discovered, the man had a history of raising questionable animals. Consensus was that because he was a half-giant, a fact that Hermione was assured was known only to a few things could hurt him. He seemed insensitive to the fact that smaller beings weren't as resilient as he was. Harry felt his stomach clench as the man came to the door. Up close, Hagrid was even more impressively large than he was at the professor's table, towering over Harry in a way that reminded Harry uncomfortably of his encounter with a troll. Supposedly, half-giants shared some of the troll's resistance to magic, which made him even more anxious. This was someone who a well-placed Diffindo couldn't do much against. "Harry?" the man asked, sounding confused. "Hello, Hagrid," Harry said. He forced himself to smile. "I decided to come over and visit. Is this a good time?" The man's face broke into a massive smile, and he said, "Come on in." The interior of Hagrid's hut was a single room, with hams and pheasants hanging from the ceiling. Harry wondered why Hagrid bothered, unless the house elves simply weren't feeding him enough. If that was true, the man needed to negotiate a better labor contract. There was a fireplace with a large copper kettle. Something was boiling inside. There was a massive bed with a patchwork quilt. There were ingredients and objects Harry couldn't recognize, but it all seemed very rustic. "I meant to invite you over anyway, Harry, but Dumbledore's been keeping me pretty busy over the past few months," Hagrid said. "He's got you helping against the Death Eaters?" Harry asked. If Dumbledore was staffing Hogwarts with his cronies who were helping in his war effort, it might explain his seeming incompetence in hiring employees. After all, soldiers weren't necessarily good teachers. Hagrid grimaced. "Never mind about that. Kid like you shouldn't have to worry about the war." Harry bit back the obvious response. He was involved, no matter what adults wanted for him, and he would be involved until the other side was dead. "I hear you were here at Hogwarts during my parents' time," Harry said. "Maybe you'd like to tell me about them." In his experience, the few wizarding adults who'd known his parents seemed to love talking about them as much as his aunt seemed to hate it. It was the easiest way to break the ice, and deep down, Harry did find himself interested. From the way Hagrid's face lit up, Harry had stumbled across a surefire conversation starter. Harry learned more about his parents in the next 30 minutes than he'd learned in a lifetime with his aunt and uncle. "So they had a house?" Harry asked. Apparently this was the man who'd delivered him to the Dursleys. Harry wasn't sure how he felt about that. On the one side, this had led to a lifetime of loveless rules and restrictions and 11 years in a cupboard. On the other hand, he'd be long dead by now if he hadn't been delivered to them, or he'd be caught in an infinite loop where he was murdered over and over again as a baby, unable to do anything to change his fate, and trapped in a private hell he'd never grow old enough to truly understand. "A little cottage in Godric's Hollow. Whatever happened to it?" Harry asked. He wondered if he owned the cottage, how much he could sell it for. "You know who didn't leave it in very good shape." "But I own it?" Harry asked. With his luck, his aunt and uncle would have long since sold it and used the money on Dudley. "Well, that and the contents of your vault," Hagrid said. "You won't be able to get control until you're 17. "My vault?" Harry asked, leaning forward. "What?" All in all, although there was no sign of the egg, his visit to Hagrid's had been very productive. "I've got enough on my hands with my studies," the Ravenclaw said. He stared at Harry. "Why would I want to help you anyway?" This was the third Ravenclaw Harry had asked, and none of them had been willing to help him. "According to the prophecy, I have a chance to beat Voldemort. If I do, that'll mean I'm pretty powerful," Harry said. "And I'll remember people who were good to me." "And what's that to me?" the Ravenclaw asked. "Unless you plan to become Minister for Magic or gain some kind of political office, your personal level of power, if of no concern." "I'll remember my enemies too," Harry said, even though he knew it was a mistake. The Ravenclaw sneered. "A first year trying to be threatening, how quaint." "Tell that to the troll," Harry muttered. The Ravenclaw stared at him for a moment and then started walking away. Harry felt frustrated. He should have done this the last time. Then he'd know who to not bother talking to and who might be open to the idea of helping him. As it was, he could tell that some of the Ravenclaws had been talking. Some of them looked at him with expressions of pity, and others sneered at him. All of them turned away when they saw them coming toward them. Harry began to wonder if the only way he was going to get any practical training was to pick fights in the hallways. But if he did that, then he suspected that Flitwick would stop teaching him. He stiffened as he felt an arm drape over his shoulder. He looked up at and saw that it was one of the Weasley twins. How had this sneaked up on him without his knowing? "People have been talking," the first brother said. "Talking a lot," the second said, "saying you've been looking for people to practice magic on." Harry shrugged out from under the arm of the first twin and stepped away. He kept his hand close to his wand. Although they hadn't bullied him in this timeline, other than an attempt to make him bald, he remembered what it had been the last time. "You can understand if people might be a little reluctant to let you practice on them," the first twin said, "after what you did to the troll." "Are you coming here to gloat?" Harry asked. "Because nobody wants to help me?" "If you don't want to listen to what we have to say, we can walk away," the first twin said, "but we were actually thinking about making a deal." "What kind of a deal?" Harry asked suspiciously. "We've been working on creative uses of potions and spells for our jokes. For some reason, people seem to be a little reluctant to be the first to try them." Harry's mind made the obvious leap. "So you are offering what? To practice with me in return for my being an experimental test subject?" "From what we've heard, you're a little mental," the first brother said, "which is what it would take to try some of the things we've come up with." Anybody would be mental if they had to go through what Harry had gone through. Was Harry willing to put himself through what was likely to be humiliating and unpleasant just for a few more hours of practice a week? "How do I know you won't poison me?" Harry asked suspiciously, "or that this is all just a gag to get me to agree, and then you'll go back on your word?" "Would we lie to you?" the second Weasley asked. He glanced at his brother. "Well, maybe, but we've heard what you do to people you aren't happy with. Besides, we're interested in seeing just what you've got," the first Weasley said. "People keep talking about you being some kind of a genius of a firstie. We'd like to see if that's true." Well, whatever they did to him wouldn't kill him permanently, and he'd have to be careful to avoid anything causing permanent damage. Although he mentally tended to lump them in with the others who had bullies him, they didn't seem to have the same kind of malice when they pulled their pranks. From what he'd heard, they'd even hit Quirrell in the back of the head with a snowball during Christmas break. Harry wondered how they'd react if they realized they'd hit Voldemort in the face. He wished he'd gone farther back in time, if only to have gotten to see it. With some reluctance, Harry agreed to the deal. Part of him regretted it already. Ingesting unknown substances didn't seem like a very good way to survive, but if they were as creative as they thought, he might find something among all the jokes that might be useful. He'd be ready the next time. Harry vowed that the fourth time he fought Quirrell was going to be the charm. He was tired of losing and tired of dying. It was time to work on winning for a change. A few weekends of having his skin turn purple wasn't that much of a price to pay.